This is Democracy Watch. Mark, all eyes right now are on the Supreme Court, which has weighed in on this question as to whether the Trump administration has to return this wrongfully accused migrant who was sent over to El Salvador of being sent back. There was a deadline that was imposed today, April 7th at 11:59 p.m. The Supreme Court has weighed in. Can you explain what just happened?
Yeah, so as you point out, this individual was subject to an order not to have him removed to El Salvador. And what the federal government then did was remove him to El Salvador, right? They sent him to El Salvador in violation of the immigration judge's prior order. There is a lawsuit, and the federal judge who hears this basically says the government has to go and have him returned by midnight tonight, okay, 11:59 tonight. The government then appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and Chief Justice Roberts has put in place a temporary stay. In other words, blocking that midnight order, that order to have him returned by midnight tonight, that has been blocked while this case is now briefed and decided by the Supreme Court.
Well, look, I know the reaction to this has been folks are pretty upset about the fact that you have somebody who this administration had already conceded was there due to an administrative error. So already the notion that we can just disappear somebody, really because of no other reason than the color of his skin at this point, to a foreign country is bad enough unto itself. But why wouldn't the response from the Supreme Court just to be like, this was clearly in error, and so yes, of course you should bring him back immediately. Why stay this decision?
Okay, so look, I am far from an apologist to the U.S. Supreme Court, and I'm not predicting, by the way, that they are going to do the right thing. I think in the most charitable light, whether they deserve that or not is another question that you and I can discuss. But in the most charitable light, what the Chief Justice would say is, look, we just got a motion from the government. And, we need to have a day or two to consider this motion to see whether the federal government has a point here or doesn't have a point here. And so in order to have the time for us to receive briefing and to make a decision, we need to just put a pause on things. And in fairness to the Chief Justice, he did order the opposition to the government's motion, in other words, this individual's lawyer, to file their brief tomorrow. So I think he is envisioning a relatively quick turnaround for the Supreme Court to decide the case. So that's the purpose of administrative stay. It is essentially to say, look, we're not judging which side's right. We're just giving the Supreme Court enough time to consider it. And that's I think what I think the court's answer would be. Now, again, that is not saying that the Supreme Court is going to get to the right decision. I have deep concerns that it will not.
In your experience, to that exact point, does the Supreme Court's decision to stay a ruling, at least while they're considering more of these details, does that signal anything? Does that offer us anything that we can glean from the tea leaves in terms of how they'll eventually rule, or are they completely separate and apart?
They're really separate and apart. I mean, the Chief Justice issued this stay without really a vote of his colleagues. So he probably doesn't even know what his colleagues think. This is
I bet he knows what some of his colleagues think.
Okay, fair enough. He knows what some of his colleagues think. The only tea leaves that ever get read into these are how quickly the case is then briefed and decided. The government sought some expedited treatment of some of their cases and frankly failed to get them. In this instance, they are very much getting expedited consideration. Like I said, the motion went in and has already led to an administrative stay. The briefing will be concluded by tomorrow. So, I think the Chief Justice is anticipating that we're going to have an outcome from the U.S. Supreme Court relatively quickly. But I wouldn't overread the fact that there is an administrative stay because, like I said, if there wasn't an administrative stay, the argument goes, then the government would never get a chance to plead its case to the Supreme Court because the order would have required the person to be removed. Now, again, I'm not sure I entirely buy that because, of course, they could bring him back. And then if they won the case, they could send him back out again or something. But that is at least what the theory I think that the Supreme Court's operating under.
You'd mentioned before that you have some concerns in terms of, even after the Supreme Court properly hears this case, some concerns about how they might rule. Why do you say that?
Yeah, I'm worried. And I think about it this way, Brian, and you and I have talked about some of this before in the context of other cases we've talked about. there are 5 justices or more on the Supreme Court to uphold a very, very strong executive, very, very strong presidential powers. And that would portend poorly here. Now, there are also almost certainly 5 votes in some circumstances to defend the role of the judiciary to issue binding orders. So it's, there's a little bit of a tug of war here, right? Like beyond the so-called merits here of whether he was or was not a member of a gang and whether or not he should or shouldn't have been, whatever. There is a fundamental tension here between the fact that the executive branch disregarded an administrative judge's order. Now, they can say it was done as an administrative error. That really doesn't matter, right? At the end of the day, there was an order not to remove him to El Salvador, and he was, in fact, removed to El Salvador. So the administration has acknowledged, although, like I said, they minimize it and put it in the category of administrative error, which is like, by the way, a little rich. I mean, administrative error is usually like, they misplaced a form for a day. They ship someone
not misplaced a human being, but yes.
Not that they send someone to
a foreign gulag.
Yeah. But that's on one side. On the other hand, you will have some Supreme Court justices who are going to argue, look, this is a El Salvadorian citizen who's in the United States, who, the government has grave doubts about, who has been sent to El Salvador. And, why is that? Like, what is the power of the court to tell the U.S. government to go now get back from El Salvador one of its own citizens? And I think that those are going to be like the two tensions before you get, like I said, even to the merits of whether he was right or wrongly targeted or right or wrongly designated as a gang member. And I worry that, at least on this Supreme Court, they are going to want to throw up their arms and say, we can't order presidents to retrieve people from foreign countries, especially when they're not U.S. citizens. And that will do damage. That will do damage not only to this individual, obviously, and his family, not only to the sort of rule of law, but it will do real damage, I think, to the ability of anyone to feel like they can rely on court orders. Because in some respects, now this was an immigration judge, not an Article 3 court, but still, it was a judge who issued this ban, and it has been violated. And at some point, if the courts are not going to stand up for the enforcement of judicial orders, then we're going to wind up in a world in which you'll have, I suspect, the Trump administration being given an inch, taking it a mile, and then saying, oh, wait, a mile is too far for us to walk back.
Is there any concern, Marc, that if the Supreme Court opts to side with the Trump team, this is a case regarding the Trump administration effectively disappearing somebody with no due process? And that in and of itself is antithetical to the Constitution, because anybody who's here has constitutional protections, and yet he wasn't afforded those. So if the Supreme Court goes ahead and says, no, it's okay, he can stay there, we're going to side with the Trump team, isn't that also them de facto saying that the whole concept of due process, the whole concept of constitutional protections for those who are not American citizens just vanishes?
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily add for not American citizens, because as you point out, you have due process rights by being present in the United States. Now, they may be different due process rights if you're a citizen versus a non-citizen, but you have the Constitution applies to people in the United States.
Right.
And Brian, in some ways, it's even worse than you laid out, because, I would argue this individual, this guy did get due process and was given the protection of an order. Like it wasn't that he didn't have any due process. He had due process and essentially won the right not to be sent back to El Salvador. And yet they did that anyway. So it's like there wasn't due process to not follow the immigration judge's order, which is in some ways worse than there having been no process at all.
Now we're effectively just in constitutional crisis territory. Instead of just eliminating one provision of the Constitution, now you're just saying the Constitution doesn't apply anymore.
That's what makes this particular case, I think, so much more troubling. I think if this person had been, in immigration detention and had just been put on a plane and sent to El Salvador, and an immigration judge had never heard the case, then he would look a lot like the Venezuelans who have been sent to the same prison, except he would be El Salvadorian. And there you're fighting, exactly as you say, over whether they get due process or didn't get due process. Here, an immigration judge actually said, don't do this thing. And then the government did it and said it was an administrative error, which is
Right.
just boy, I mean, I'm not sure that I accept that it couldn't be. It may have been an error. I mean, it was an error, but it may have been even something they didn't intend to violate the court's order. But it was hardly just an administrative error. I mean, it wasn't like he was, put in cell A versus cell B, or he was brought to the wrong courthouse for it. I mean, he was literally sent to this gulag of a prison in El Salvador, and so yeah, that's why I say I think that this is going to be a hard call for some of the justices on the Supreme Court, because on the one hand, they will be sympathetic to the executive branch being able to run foreign policy and being able to run immigration. On the other hand, they've got to weigh the fact that if they let that happen here, they have effectively just allowed the administration to blow through
Right.
the order that was in place here. And that, I think, becomes incredibly dangerous because, Brian, there are lots of legal constraints on what the administration can do. I mean, the administration can't, for example, send a U.S. citizen to El Salvador. But the president of the United States mused over the weekend that maybe he can, maybe he'd like to see that, or maybe that's an option. And it would be a hell of a thing if we were sitting here and said, well, they sent an American citizen there, and the U.S. government's position was, oops, that was an administrative oversight.
Right. And finally, Marc, let's finish off with this, because, the DOJ did argue this in court, and there were lawyers who deigned to be honest about what was happening in court, and the DOJ has since removed those attorneys, removed those prosecutors from the DOJ. Can I have your reaction to that?
Yeah, so look, I've had a more mixed reaction here than I think a lot of people on the left have. I think a lot of people on the left, they immediately see these DOJ lawyers as sort of heroes, right? They admitted the thing that that this was an error and that this was a mistake, and then they were removed, and they are the victims of Donald Trump. And I don't disagree with that in the main. But you and I have had this conversation now in across a bunch of cases, including the Eric Adams case and that. I mean, these DOJ lawyers were standing up in a courtroom defending the Department of Justice's removal of this individual, right? They got in trouble essentially for acknowledging it was an administrative error, all right, not for the fact that they didn't stand up in this position. So I do think, Brian, we are at a point where there is this open question about what are we to expect of government lawyers. I expect that government lawyers won't take on cases and will risk their jobs to not argue for immoral or illegal things. That is where I draw the line. But there are lots of people who are drawing the line slightly differently. They're saying, look, if you'd rather have better, more ethical lawyers than less ethical and worse people. And so, if you have people who can walk that balance and still maintain some level of credibility, that's better. I don't know, Brian, which one the right answer is. In this case, it is certainly the case that these lawyers did admit something to the court that was very helpful to the individuals who've been detained and their family, and they have been removed. And it's interesting that the Fourth Circuit that issued an opinion in this case after the Supreme Court got the case, which is procedurally weird unto itself. But even there, some of the conservative judges on the court indicated that these lawyers had been removed for essentially being candid with the court, which is actually their job.
Right. And we couldn't possibly have that. Well, look, I think all of this underscores the need for folks who are going to act with integrity, who are going to fight the worst excesses of this administration. That's what you and your team have been doing relentlessly since the very beginning, since Trump took office. So for everybody watching right now, one small step that we can all take to show some appreciation, show some support for the work that Marc and his team are doing is to sign up for Democracy Docket, which is the newest outlet he founded to focus on everything voting and elections. I'll put the link right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
I'm Marc Elias.
This is Democracy Watch.